Hello, and welcome back to this week's episode of Reverence for Reverie. Over the past few weeks, I've been just sitting in, I'd say maybe it's the quiet afterglow of the Soul Circle that I hosted, and not so much to revisit what happened there. It was a beautiful gathering, but more about attuning to what began to move in me. When the external noise softens and the energy of a shared experience begins to settle, what remains is often maybe what we would call just the truest frequency of transformation. And for me, that frequency in this season of life has really sounded like community. It's just this deep and resonant knowing that transformation doesn't happen in isolation. We can do some immense work alone. We can read and we can reflect and meditate and analyze. But something very different and I would say almost alchemical happens in the presence of others. It happens in the field that exists in between us, in that subtle exchange of our nervous systems and the silent nods of recognition, the shared breath of understanding. Transformation really unfolds not just in our insight, but more so in the mirroring, in being seen and heard and felt, perhaps for the first time by another. And there is an unmistakable power and resonance in that. I see it as the same energy that ancient mystics felt in their gatherings, that same impulse that draws us all to ceremony or to gather around a piece of art or to the act of sharing language itself. It's like when we come together with an intention, there's something larger than any one of us that begins to move through us, something that's more collective, something that is more ancient and ties us all together. But also, as I've been integrating that experience, there's something else that's made itself known. And that's really, an emphasis on the importance of being in integrity with my own energy. Because in community, it's really easy to attune outward, to feel others and to hold space, to ride the waves of this kind of collective movement or transformation that begins to occur. But I've also really been paying closer attention to when my own energy feels truly alive versus when I'm moving from a place of obligation or from maybe an old identity that believes it needs to perform expansion to really stay worthy of the connection. I think there is a subtle difference between allowing life to really move through us and then trying to keep momentum going because we're afraid of what stillness might reveal. So, all of that said, my practice lately has just been to notice and, to notice when my energy contracts, to notice when the impulse to do more arises before that inner movement to be has really had its chance, maybe its opportunity to complete. And to really notice when I'm trying to force transformation rather than allowing a natural rhythm of integration to unfold. Because I think that integration, has its own rhythm all to itself. It's quieter, it's slower, but it is profoundly intelligent. It is the holy or sacred pause that really allows what was stirred in whatever season of life that is. Maybe for me or for you, even it was in this soul circle, but there's many opportunities of life where something can stir within us, where we start to take the descent. So, it is this pause. Integration is this pause that really allows for whatever it is that gets stirred to begin to take root in ourselves. And that's really what I want to speak to today. It's the sacred space between that inspiration and embodiment in the embodied knowing. Because that pause is not a delay, and so often we mistake it as delay, but actually we can see it as a deepening. And that is the work of integration. So today we'll be talking about integration. Let's go ahead and dive in. So we certainly live in a culture addicted to novelty, and inspiration in that kind of environment just feels easy. It feels like the thing we're all striving for. We're all chasing the next insight in the same way that we might chase the next hit of caffeine. Hello, that is me, the coffee lover. I love it. Or we might chase validation, external validation, something that wakes us up and makes us feel alive again. And we love the spark. I know in the spiritual community, it can be called like the download or the clarity that just sort of cuts through the confusion like a lightning bolt. That moment, when it's like everything seems like it makes sense, or when all the pieces are finally clicking and we can kind of see the outline begin to take form of who we are becoming. Inspiration gives us this illusion of momentum. It's the high point on the wave. It is bright and shining and luminous. It can be intoxicating and it can feel fast. But integration, that is actually where the real work, the real alchemy or transformation happens. And integration is what happens after something maybe feels like an end, maybe it's after the retreat ends or the soul circle ends, or after the session completes, after a summit, after a breakthrough moment. It's the part where like lights sort of seem to dim. I'm imagining the stage and the lights dim and the curtain closes and we're just left with ourselves again. We're left with our patterns and our habits and our relationships and our body. And this is where, insight needs to come down from the mountain, that peak of the mountaintop, and have to learn how to walk through the village with this knowledge that we've received. When the mind's revelation has to really meet the body's rhythm, and truth stops being some idea and starts asking for us to live it. You cannot think your way forever into integration. This is the difference between epistemological understanding, which is theoretical and it lives in the mind and it is about knowledge, into an ontological understanding or knowing that is lived, it is embodied, it is experienced in life, right? You have to metabolize. That is what integration is. It needs to pass through your nervous system. It needs to pass through your breath, through the choices that you're going to make when no one is still watching. So integration really asks, can you hold this frequency, not just when it's bright and luminous or when you're getting applause, but when it's lonely? Can you stay with the thing that you saw once all of the glitter fades or the lights dim or the curtains close? Can you let the lesson actually descend down from your intellect into your instincts until it's not something you just know in your mind, but something you are, something you are living, you are being? Maybe other ways to say this are the ways that inspiration can kind of inflate and hold us up and bring us forward. And yet integration humbles us, and we need to have both in balance. Inspiration lights the fire underneath us, but integration is what really teaches us how to tend that fire, to keep it going and sustainable. You know, if you've sat around a bonfire, it can't stay at its highest heat forever. We have to learn to stoke the fire, to keep the flames going. Otherwise, they dwindle out. So the truth of all of this is that integration really rarely, honestly, feels like an expansion phase. Most often, I'm not going to say it's like never feeling like expansion, but most often it really feels like contraction. It can feel confusing. Like, I was just riding this high, and then now all I want to do is pull everything back. What's going on here? Right? It can also feel like nothing is happening. Or sometimes even I've heard people fear that it means they're going backwards. But I want you to know that underneath the stillness, there is something very sacred that's taking shape. You know, I'm going to go back to a metaphor I've used before, which is the caterpillar inside of the chrysalis. You know, everyone talks about the butterfly, but we're not talking about what happens in the in-between, how that caterpillar literally dissolves into formlessness. It becomes like a soup of what it was before. And then it reorganizes itself into something entirely new. That is the slow and sacred work of integration. You know, it's not glamorous, but it is necessary. Without that, we aren't the butterfly. The butterfly does not emerge. It cannot fly. You know, that place where all of your old structures are kind of melting down so that your next form can emerge. And guys, this will happen over and over and over again throughout life. We need to have the capacity to be with that process over and over again. And, you know, if you were to interrupt the process too soon with the caterpillar that's kind of melting down inside of the chrysalis, if you crack open that cocoon before it is time, I think it's obvious the butterfly is not going to take flight, right? So integration is that cocoon. It's sort of the holding space where reorganization happens, and it looks like stillness, and it looks like maybe going inward, and sometimes it looks kind of messy. It does not give us this high of becoming someone new immediately. It really just asks us to stay with who we've always been, but to make room at the very same time for who we're becoming. That is quieter. It is certainly slower, but it is so, so necessary. It is sacred, because that really is the place where transformation is no longer just an idea, but it starts to become a way of life. In psychoanalysis, we often talk about the idea of resistance to the process. And I don't always love to name it in that way, but there is a truth in that. And it is the psyche's way of protecting us from what feels threatening in change, right? So after a moment of transformation, so like a deep session or some profound realization, or we venture into areas that we've not wanted to go before, it's very common to feel a pullback into what's familiar. We might move to surface level for a while again, right? And we tell ourselves stories like, well, maybe I overreacted, or, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal. I can come back to that later. I don't need to look at that. I don't need to worry about that right now. And what I need you to hear is that is not failure. It's not a problem that happens. That is the unconscious at work. It's trying to restore equilibrium, right? The ego craves the known, even when that known is painful to us, because familiarity feels safer than expansion. And that is truly the work of our brain, is to keep us safe, not successful. I recently felt this pull in myself as well. I was moving through a particularly trying season. And this has been, maybe a couple of years ago. But I sought some guidance from a mentor that I deeply respected. We have an ongoing relationship. But in this particular exchange or particular season, maybe I would say, I wasn't feeling held. There's something in the ways that conversations had unfolded that really left me feeling unseen, and it just wasn't what I needed in the season that I was in. And there was a part of me that really used to equate harmony with safety. And I wanted to just let it slide. You know what? We'll just smooth things over. I'm going to swallow down my experience so that I can stay likable and contained and agreeable. That was a very familiar version of me. That is the one who learned very early on in my life that belonging required my silence. That love would require shape-shifting myself, becoming what the other person wanted or needed. And for a moment, I would say that version of me is who was going to reach for the mic, right? Let's not make waves. Let's just move on. It wasn't that big of a deal. But another part of me, the part of me that's really been doing this long, tedious work of self-awareness and integration and the shifting of really generational patterns of silence, knew that kind of silence would be such a betrayal to myself of everything that I've been learning. So I sat with it. I was thoughtful about it. I took a breath and I chose to speak up. And this was not from a place of accusation or reactivity, but just from my truth. Naming what I felt very clearly, of course, with tact. And something really remarkable happened in that moment. I mean, I had been terrified. This is a mentor that I'd really looked up to. And instead of rupture, there was more respect that was garnered. The honesty that I was able to bring forward without reactivity, but shared in a thoughtful, metabolized kind of way, really opened a deeper channel of trust and connection between the two of us. And that conversation became a hinge point, because in that moment, I really allowed my inner voice to be heard, and it echoed elsewhere. I started to speak up differently in other relationships. I began to take up more space, even in my work, in my leadership of others, in so many different ways. And I continue to feel, of course, nervousness if I have to enter into a more difficult kind of conversation, but I can do it now without the same kind of fear. In fact, I will say terror that it used to bring up within my body. So that was an integration space, in real time. It was this movement from knowing about what I should do into living it, to actually doing it, putting it into practice. And that is what builds confidence. And that is what paves the way for new ways of being over time. So that example that I'm giving is kind of what it looks like to actually resist the resistance, right? To interrupt that compulsion to repeat the same old behavior that gets you the same old places. Beyond described how, and Beyond, I've mentioned before, is a psychoanalyst. He described how the mind attacks linking when it's on the verge of insight. How we'll distract and we'll minimize and we'll rationalize or we'll retreat. There's a multitude of ways that we can do this, but it's anything to avoid the vulnerability of the change that we can sense that will take place if we begin to actually link the way that we feel with what is going on. And so the moment transformation begins to take hold, something inside of us will kind of scramble to restore this familiar architecture of the self that we have used up to this point. But integration becomes this sort of quiet rebellion against that impulse. It's actually the staying with what is uncomfortable long enough for it to begin to rewire us, for links to be created, new links to be created and named and metabolized. It's this decision to hold steady at the threshold instead of like retreating into what has always been known. And I want to really acknowledge something here. These are large concepts. So ideas about attacks on linking, things like that. There are entire bodies of psychoanalytic work and, even spiritual thought that we're just brushing up against in this very brief conversation here. They are meaty and they are nuanced and they're not easily reduced. So I want to really be clear about that. But for the sake of the time that we have here, and just for simplicity's sake in this conversation, what I want you to take away from this conversation is this: integration isn't just a single act. It's a repeated choice. It is, housed in each time you meet your discomfort, and then you decide just to stay a little bit longer, or to breathe instead of retreating, or to really feel what's happening instead of fleeing and avoiding. All of that means that you are participating in that rewiring internally. And then over time, these moments are what become the scaffolding of a new self, and one that can hold more of life without fragmentation under the weight of all of it. So we often mistake that discomfort for a kind of regression, and sometimes it may be regression, but there is such a thing as regression in service of the ego. Whenever we go backwards to go forward, and that is the evidence that something new is actually beginning to take root, where a new psychic structure begins to form, and a new level of self-trust is anchoring in that process as well. This is truly how transformation becomes embodied. It's not in all these grand gestures, but actually in these small moments when we really choose our integrity over avoidance, or we choose our truth over keeping the peace or staying in harmony with everyone. And not that those always have to be in conflict with one another. Often what we find is we can hold our truth and remain in harmony. Not with everyone. Every relationship, every co-created experience is co-created. It requires another person to engage in it. But that is the way that we transform ourselves throughout those moments. And that really is the real work of integration. It's the willingness to let this kind of lesson live through us, even when our old self or the primary programming and conditioning wants us to really stay small. And that's for safety. We can have compassion for that. So how is it then that we stay with transformation instead of abandoning it? I think that's often what comes up at this point, right? Is, well, if we don't run from it and we don't avoid and we don't look at it like it's something wrong, then what do we do? Well, first, we need to slow down. Integration has its very own tempo. It is much slower than the rush of insight and steadier over time than the sparks of inspiration that kind of keep us going. You cannot rush embodiment. The psyche will move at the speed of safety, not urgency. I'm going to say that again. Your psyche moves at the speed of safety, not urgency. Safety is created in the slowness, in the ritual, in the allowing ourselves to be with. So, and what's important to really remember here is this process is entirely individual. So there are no two people that will look the same when it comes to integration. There's also, even within one person, there is such a multiplicity of ways that this can look. You might metabolize one shift very quickly in your life and then find another one in another area of life seems to take months, even years, to really fully inhabit a new way of being, because this work truly is not linear. It spirals. You're going to revisit old lessons through new layers of consciousness. Every time you work through something, your consciousness has expanded, but you're still going to encounter these same themes and experiences again. And you'll just be looking at them from new layers. Something new becomes revealed. And sometimes what seems to look like backwards motion is really just the psyche revisiting another place that's ready to be integrated more deeply. So the only real pace that matters is the one that your system, your individual nervous system can sustain. And we must respect that rhythm, because if you try to push past, if you move from urgency, what you think is faster is going to slow you down inevitably. This is the paradox, slowing down to speed up. And when I say speed up, it does not mean it's fast. So when we slow down to that kind of rhythm, integration can actually begin to take root. Second, what we must do is stay close to the body. So transformation is not something that you can think your way into. Like I've said, it really lives in sensation, in the breath, the gut, the aches behind the heart and in the rib cage and throughout the body. When you notice resistance, when you notice the fatigue, the contraction, maybe it's the impulse to distract yourself from something. That's your psyche beginning to negotiate a change. And your nervous system is saying, okay, this is new and I'm learning how to hold it. And I want to pull away and I want to go back, right? Just stay curious. Stay gentle with yourself. Make yourself a negotiation. Maybe I'm not ready for the whole big bite, but what if I take a nibble right here? What would a nibble look like, right? We want to stay curious and stay gentle, and the body is going to tell you what it's ready for if you are willing to listen. Third is that we need to anchor in community. So just like I mentioned in the soul circle, the field really holds what the individual cannot. And we are meant to regulate, to mirror, and to evolve through connection in relationship. We are wired in connection. We are hurt in connection, and we are healed in connection to others. And that doesn't always mean a vast community or some large network of people. Sometimes the community is simply one person. Maybe it's a really close friend, a therapist, a partner, a mentor, someone who can actually hold space for you when you forget who you're becoming. And even one single steady presence can make the difference between retreating into isolation and staying in the process long enough for it to integrate. So the point is absolutely not how many people hold this field with you, but that you allow yourself to be held at all. This kind of stuff cannot be done alone. Otherwise, we inevitably will pull back and we will not be sustained and will run from every opportunity that's calling us forward. It's just integration isn't a solitary act, honestly. I mean, yes, it's happening on this very internal level, but it's stabilized in relationship. It is mirrored and magnified and stabilized in that kind of collective field, however small or spacious that it may be. And then finally, we need to honor the rhythm. There will be seasons of expansion and seasons of integration. One is not better than the other. Expansion is like the spring and summer of the psyche. It's expressive and it's radiant and it's outward and it's in blossom, and we can see things happening on the outside, right? Whereas integration is like the fall and the winter. It is the quiet, interior kind of turning inward, regenerative phase. And just as nature cycles through this sort of bloom and decay, we too are seasonal beings. We are nature. We aren't separate from it. Winter looks very barren on the outside, but what we know to be true is that beneath the surface, the soil is regenerating. The roots are actually deepening. Seeds are preparing for their emergence, right? So that unseen work that's going on below the surface is what even makes spring possible. Integration is the same. It can look like stillness. It can feel like a contraction, but it's actually the most generative act of all. So when you can imagine when you're bypassing that, when you're trying to push past all the time, overworking yourself, going, you're going to miss something vital. And that is where that transformation really consolidates into coherence, where everything that you have learned finds its rightful place within you, and you feel like you are moving in harmony with yourself. So when you find yourself in that quieter season, when all of that inspiration has kind of cooled and you're not sure what's next, I'd encourage you not to rush to reignite the fire. Try to trust the intelligence of your inner winter, if you want to call it that. Let it do what it is meant to do, because integration really is what allows what has been awakened within you to become alive. And it's not the absence of growth, it is the deep rooting of it. So, to bring us to a close for today, if you find yourself in one of those in-between moments right now, maybe you're not inspired or you're not clear or not feeling that, on fire or oomph, maybe that's exactly where you're meant to be right now. And I don't think it means you're losing the magic. You are embodying it. You are not falling behind. You're actually being rewoven into this deeper coherence, right? Let that transformation settle. Let it root in you. Let it begin to reshape you quietly from the inside out. Because this is the work. It's not to chase the next breakthrough as soon as you've finished with one, but to become the person who can really live what's already been revealed. I really hope that this season that we're moving into, we're moving into fall, that sort of quiet return inward. I hope that this brings you the grace to integrate what you've received, to let you mirror what happens in nature, the courage to stay with what's uncomfortable, and the discernment to know that stillness is its own kind of movement. Now, if this conversation resonated with you, and if you find yourself maybe looking for spaces that hold both depth and becoming, I'd really love to stay connected. You can do that by joining my email list, where I share other riffs, reverie, and reflections on the psycho-spiritual journey of leadership and the becoming of a self, along with other opportunities to work with me, to gather in community, and also to explore this kind of work in just deeper and more embodied sorts of ways. And speaking of community, I'm also creating something new, and it's not open yet. I'm actually in my own season of kind of just being with and integrating this, but it is being built for exactly this. It's the space to be held both in integration and expansion without all the noise or the pressure or the expectations to do more and be more. Just a simple sort of sacred space to come together and to share what we're learning, and then to be witnessed in it. And so if you'd like to be the first to know when that opens, make sure you're on the list. You will find that link in the show notes, along with the link to join my email list. Of course, if you would like to leave a review, that is always so helpful in making this message get to the people who need it or are looking for it most. So until next time, let the work breathe through you, trust your own rhythm, and as always, let the reverie lead you. And I'll meet you there.